They built sanctuaries, they said, places of safety, charity, hope. But behind the Winslows' pristine legacy lies a truth so devastating. It was buried, literally, for decades. No photos, no records, no children left to speak. This is a story they were never meant to survive. If you're brave enough to remember what the world was designed to forget, subscribe now and bear witness to the silence they tried to erase in the autumn of 2017. I arrived in the town of Elm Ridge not as a journalist, not as a skeptic, but as a tired, disillusioned man looking for silence. The kind of silence that doesn't echo with the hum of traffic or the buzz of screens, but sits thick in the air like dust. I wasn't chasing a story. Not at first. I had buried my mother a month earlier after a sudden stroke, and sorting through her things led me to a box I hadn't seen in decades. Inside were old letters, one in particular from a woman named Evelyn Winslow addressed to my great-grandmother, dated 1938. It was written in elegant, deliberate cursive, the kind that required patience, and it began with a thank you. Your donation has allowed us to open another sanctuary for the forgotten, it read. It closed with a line that stirred something in my gut. We make homes for those time would otherwise abandon. I had never heard the name Evelyn Winslow. My mother had never mentioned her. But the letter was warm, grateful, and yet there was something unsettling in its tone, an implication of burden too heavy for ink. The return address led to Elm Ridge, a rural New England town tucked far from major highways, whose main street hadn't changed in 70 years. I drove up on a whim, telling myself it was a personal pilgrimage, a way to shake grief's grip by chasing the past through its fading trails. I arrived on a Sunday morning, and the church bell rang without a soul around. The streets were lined with rusted bikes, empty benches, stores that smelled of yellowed paper and peppermint. There was something about Elm Ridge that felt staged, like a memory too intact to be real. I checked into the only inn in town, an old Victorian that creaked inside like it resented being kept alive. The innkeeper, a wiry woman named Ruth with rheumy eyes, looked at me strangely when I asked about the Winslows. She hesitated a beat too long before replying. Nice people, long gone. Built orphanages, good for the community. Her voice flattened near the end, as if she'd recited that line 1,000 times. I asked where the orphanages were. She said only one still stood, Hollow Glen, but it had been boarded up for decades. I asked about records or survivors, and her expression pinched like I'd mentioned something indecent. No one ever kept much of that, she said, then handed me my key and turned away. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the Winslow letter again. The paper had browned at the edges, but the ink was sharp. I thought about how casually Evelyn spoke of her sanctuaries. I searched online for Winslow orphanages and found only brief mentions in state archives, mostly philanthropic commendations, nothing personal, no interviews, no photographs of the children. It was as if the homes existed only on paper. No census data mentioned them. No alumni associations. Not even a scandal or accusation. Just nothing. That's what chilled me. Even the most unremarkable orphanages leave some trace. School records, medical files, newspaper articles about fairs, or school plays. But the Winslows had built 6 of them across 3 counties, and there was not a single record of a child's name. Not one. I returned to Ruth's desk the next morning and asked again, this time with more directness, about the children. She stared at me for a long time, then whispered, "There's no one left to ask," and turned her back. I drove to Hollow Glen that afternoon. The building was about 10 miles outside of town, past a series of frost-heaved roads and overgrown trails that seemed to push back against being driven. It was built in 1924, according to an old brass plaque by the gate, and from a distance it resembled a sanitarium. 3 stories gray brick, windows boarded from inside. The gates were locked with rusted chains, but the fence had collapsed in parts. I stepped through and immediately felt a pressure in my chest. Not fear, exactly, more like a deep, abiding sorrow that clung to the walls like ivy. The courtyard was empty save for a single broken swing, its chains groaning in the wind. The front door had been nailed shut, but I found a shattered window on the side. I climbed in, tearing my jacket on a rusted edge. Inside, the air was cold, thick with mildew and rot. The foyer had a grand staircase, now collapsed, and the wallpaper peeled like shedding skin. I wandered through hallways littered with broken toys, water-warped books, and small shoes. So many shoes. Tiny shoes, lined neatly against the wall of what used to be a dining hall. None larger than a child of 6 would wear. There were murals, too, faint beneath grime and time. They depicted scenes of children holding hands in fields of lilies, smiling beneath a sun that had eyes. But none of them were signed. No names. I found what looked like an old filing room, but the cabinets were empty, some torn from the wall entirely. Burn marks licked the ceiling. Someone had tried to erase something, not just destroy, but unmake. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, sifting through ashes, hoping for a scrap of paper, a photograph, something human. But there was nothing, and that's when it started to dawn on me. It wasn't just that the children were missing. It was that they had been erased. I returned to Elmridge shaken, more so than I could admit. I stopped by the town library, a tiny red brick building run by an elderly man named George. When I asked about the Winslows, his eyes lit up, not with warmth, but with the spark of memory long buried. Evelyn Winslow, he asked. Now there was a woman of means, came from New Haven, married into the rail money. She ran those homes like ministries, said it was her calling. I asked him if he ever met any of the children. His smile faded. I don't recall. Isn't that strange, he said, as if realizing it for the first time. You'd think I would, but no, not a one. I asked about records. He pointed me to the town's historical archive, which was mostly church bulletins and town ledgers. I spent the next 4 hours there and found nothing. No adoption notices, no school registrations, no obituaries for any child raised in a Winslow orphanage, not even a list of names. The children were ghosts, but not in the paranormal sense. They were blank spots in a history that should have been crowded with stories. I returned to the inn that evening with a weight I couldn't explain. That night, I dreamed of the children's shoes, rows and rows of them, all pointing east, as if waiting to be worn again. I woke before dawn, heart racing. I wasn't looking for a story when I came to Elmridge, but something in that town wasn't right, and I couldn't let it go. I didn't want to turn it into a journalistic pursuit. It felt wrong to do that to children who may have suffered, but I needed answers. Who were they? Where did they go? Why does no one remember them? And who was Evelyn Winslow really? Not the philanthropist in the press clippings, but the woman who wrote to my great-grandmother about sanctuaries for the forgotten. The word haunted me. Forgotten. What does it take for an entire generation of children to be forgotten by time? What kind of silence allows that? As I sat at the edge of my bed, staring out the cracked window at the indifferent town below, I made myself a promise. I would not leave Elmridge until I could name at least one of them. Just one child. A name, a face, a story. Anything to prove they were real. Because if I couldn't, then maybe they never were. Or worse. Maybe someone made sure that when I began my research into the Winslows with a renewed determination, driven less by curiosity now and more by a quiet, moral ache that grew stronger with each question I couldn't answer. What began as a detour from grief was quickly becoming a mission haunted by a suffocating absence. Because for a family so publicly praised, the Winslows were shockingly opaque in every way that mattered. I drove to the County Historical Society in Rentham, the closest city with state-level archives, and spent 2 full days buried in old newspapers, charity rosters, land registries, and local government minutes. What I uncovered painted the Winslows as something close to royalty in the charitable world of the 1920s through the early 1950s. Evelyn and Thomas Winslow were celebrated benefactors, known for establishing homes for wayward and unwanted children during the Great Depression, a time when thousands were displaced, orphaned, or simply abandoned due to economic collapse. The couple had no biological children of their own, a fact often mentioned in press articles with a kind of glowing reverence, as if their philanthropic pursuits were proof of a more saintly form of parenthood. They built 6 orphanages in total, 2 in Massachusetts, 1 each in Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and a final home in upstate New York, all funded to the Winslow Foundation for Human Development, a non-governmental trust created in 1925. Newspapers from the era praised the Winslows as saviors of the destitute, calling them guardians of forgotten. But for all the ink spilled on their generosity, I could not find a single in-depth profile, personal interview, or quote from the children they supposedly raised. The articles all read the same: smiling portrait of Evelyn handing over a large check, photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies outside fresh brick buildings, and statements from local politicians congratulating the Winslows for uplifting moral youth. I began to feel something sour settle in my gut. These were all surface-level accolades, but beneath them, the people, the children, were still invisible. I turned to Public Records Office to trace census data for the orphanages, hoping to find names, ages, even head counts. But the facilities were registered as religious residential institutions, which at the time did not require disclosure of occupants' identities. What little I found were dry administrative notes. Capacity, 58. Beds, 60. Staff, 7. No names, no daily logs. I found several handwritten letters from Evelyn to state officials thanking them for zoning permissions or permits, always signed her full name and a drawing of a lily beside it. The same flower appeared in the wallpaper back at Hollow Glen. But what disturbed me most was a 3-sentence memo buried in a box of 1940s correspondence and signed and unheaded. Winslow homes have met quota for the year. No further transfers requested. File inactive until 1951. The memo didn't mention children. It sounded more like livestock management. The word quota lodged in my brain like a splinter. I made a list of all known Winslow orphanages and began calling the towns where they'd operated. Most of the numbers led to disconnected lines, but a few historical societies picked up. Each one repeated the same hollow refrain. The Winslows were generous people. Their homes were a blessing. But when I asked if they had any records of the children, there was always a pause, long enough to feel rehearsed, before someone admitted that the files had either been lost, destroyed, or never kept. At one point, I drove to the town of Dalmore in northern Vermont to visit the site of what was once the Winslow Haven Home for Girls. The building was gone, replaced by a strip mall, but an elderly woman in the diner next door remembered when it stood. "Big stone house," she said, shaking her head slowly. "Black windows. Never saw the girls come out. Just saw deliveries go in." I asked if she'd known any of the girls. She frowned. "You know, I don't think I did. Isn't that strange?" That phrase again. Isn't that strange? It followed me like a shadow. One night, back in Elmridge, I sat in the town records room staring at a wall of directories and yearbooks from the local high school. I flipped through volumes from 1930 to 1960 and found not a single child listed as living at a Winslow orphanage. Even the teachers, when interviewed in archived newsletters, never mentioned those homes. It was as if the orphanages operated in a vacuum, invisible to the community. But the newspaper clippings, the fundraising drives, and the political endorsements were real, palpably so. There were photos of Evelyn Winslow dining with senators, attending galas, even meeting the First Lady in 1949 at a luncheon for child welfare. All the optics of virtue, none of the substance. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I was uncovering was a carefully engineered myth, public benevolence hiding private absence. One article from 1952 praised Evelyn's wholesome influence over young minds and claimed her homes had helped over 2,000 children find purpose. That number stuck with me. 2,000. And yet, not one of them had left a footprint I could find. No marriages, no deaths, no criminal records, no college graduations. Not a single obituary identifying someone as a Winslow orphan. I began wondering if these children had ever been allowed to grow up. The emotional toll crept in slowly, like fog. I imagined myself as one of them, nameless, faceless, tucked away in a home with barred windows, being told the outside world wasn't for me. I imagined birthdays without songs, illnesses without comfort, tears shed in empty dorms. I tried not to let it consume me, but at night I heard phantom footsteps, children's voices in my sleep. Not ghosts, just echoes of lives denied. I stared at old photos of Evelyn and Thomas, their smiles tight and immaculate. What kind of people cultivate an image so pristine, yet leave no trail of those they were said to help. And why did the towns revere them still, as if speaking their names carried weight or fear? On my 4th day in Elmridge, I stopped by the local church where Evelyn was once a major benefactor. The building was ancient, with ivy-covered stones and pews that smelled of cedar and ash. The pastor was new, young, and unaware of most town history, but he allowed me to look at the old donor registry. Evelyn Winslow's name was listed over 24 times, often accompanied by large donations earmarked for youth programs and community development. One entry stood out, a donation made in 1947 for something called the Ascension Fund. When I asked what that was, the pastor just shrugged. Sounds like a renovation project, or maybe a scholarship. But there was no record of it ever being used. I left the church with a cold hollowness in my chest. Evelyn Winslow had been everywhere in this town, and yet nowhere at all. Her money had shaped buildings, influenced elections, funded parades, but her legacy, when examined up close, was like smoke. There was a generosity to her presence, but it was a kind that silenced rather than uplifted, a quiet benevolence that covered things up, that replaced messy truths with polished myth. And still, I could not find a single child story. I called state adoption agencies, who said they had no surviving files from Winslow homes due to a fire in 1978. How convenient. I called former staff listed in decade-old phone books. Most were dead. The rest refused to speak. I even reached out to a sociologist who'd written a dissertation on early 20th century private orphanages. When I mentioned the Winslow homes, he paused and said, "I've heard whispers. People say they were different. Not worse necessarily, but harder to look into." I asked why. He said, "Because they left no survivors." I ended the call there, heart pounding. Was that hyperbole? Or was it a slip of truth too heavy to carry? I stared again at the letter from Evelyn to my great-grandmother. Its ink crisp and careful. We make homes for those time would otherwise abandon. That word again, abandon. Not nurture. Not raise. Just keep. I looked up at my motel's ceiling, stained with years of neglect, and thought about those homes, all 6 of them, dotting the northeastern landscape like unmarked graves. Who were the children that once lived in them? Why were they never spoken of? And why was I the only one still asking? I returned to Hollow Glen with a crowbar and a camera, not out of bravado, but because something inside me had shifted. This was no longer research. It was a reckoning, and if no one else was going to dig through the dust and bones of the Winslows' legacy, then I had no choice but to do it myself. The front door gave way with a few heavy strikes, cracking open like a mouth unsealed after years of forced silence, and the smell that burst forth was beyond decay. It was a smell of memory trapped and rotting. The foyer swallowed my footsteps as I crossed the threshold, the creak of the floorboards stretching beneath my weight like a strained sigh, and for the first few minutes I didn't speak, didn't breathe too loudly, just stood there absorbing the soundless press of time layered thick in every shadowed corner. The wallpaper, once floral and bright, now hung in damp rags, curling like dying petals along the seams, and each room I entered seemed to collapse inward, as if it resented being remembered. The dining hall, long since stripped of furniture, bore only the gouged outline of where tables once stood, and in the far corner a cracked chalkboard still bore the faint outline of the sentence, "We are always watched." I stared at those words until my eyes burned, wondering if it had been a rule, a warning, or a confession. The kitchen was a shell, rusted pans dangling like forgotten instruments, and behind a steel door I found the pantry, lined with empty cans and a single cracked porcelain bowl, its center decorated with a painted lily. That flower again. It haunted everything Evelyn Winslow touched, as if her legacy required a symbol to mask its emptiness. I moved to the dormitories next, stepping into rooms that had once held rows of beds, now gutted, leaving only the skeletal metal frames and piles of dust-choked linens that disintegrated at my touch. On the far wall of one room, etched with something sharp, were dozens of tally marks, not grouped, not organized, just scattered like desperate whispers clawed into plaster. I traced my fingers along them, try and feel the hands that made them, and the silence of that room thickened until it felt like I was drowning in it. Upstairs, the hallway had collapsed in parts, forcing me to climb over beams and chunks of fallen ceiling. I found a nursery with pale blue walls stained by rain and time. In the center was a single wooden rocking horse, its paint flaking, its eyes scratched out. On the adjacent wall were faint crayon drawings of stick-figured children holding hands beneath the sun, but the figures were all identical, drawn over and over again as if the artist was trying to remember a face in failing. I took photos of everything, even though I didn't know what I would do with them. They felt like proof of something I couldn't yet name. In the attic, I found a locked chest beneath a mold-eaten tarp. I forced it open and found a bundle of uniforms, tiny gray tunics with sewn-on name tags. Only the names were missing. Each tag was blank, as if never filled in or deliberately erased. Who sews name tags without writing names? Who strips children of identity so thoroughly they become nothing but fabric in silence? I sat there for a long time, holding one of the tunics, and I imagined a little boy no older than 5 wearing it, his feet too small for the hard floors, his voice swallowed by discipline and cold. I imagined him watching the seasons change through barred windows, waiting for someone to say his name. The grief that hit me wasn't my own, but it settled into my bones like it belonged there. I descended to the basement last, flashlight shaking as I made my way down the narrow stairs. The smell grew heavier, like mildew mixed with something older, and the walls dripped with condensation. The basement was larger than I expected, split into storage areas and what appeared to be isolation rooms. Small spaces with heavy doors and sliding grates, the kind you'd see in outdated asylums. I stepped inside one, and the door swung shut behind me, thudding in a way that made my skin crawl. There were scratch marks on the inside, not clawed in panic, but methodical. Hundreds of straight lines etched into the wall, each about the length of a finger. I left the door ajar after that. In the far corner of the basement, behind a toppled filing cabinet, I found a bundle of pages sealed in a rusted tin box. The ink had run on most of them, but a few were still legible. They appeared to be activity logs, written by someone named M. Healy, possibly a head matron. The pages mentioned meal distributions, supply shortages, and routine inspections. But one line stood out in the middle of an otherwise banal entry. 3 unfit for March quota, not transferred, awaiting directive. That word again. Quota, it kept appearing like a dark refrain, and I began to wonder if the Winslow sanctuaries were less about protection and more about management. Children reduced to tallies, transfers, quotas, numbers to be met, not lives to be cherished. I left Hollow Glen, that evening with my heart clutched in a vice. I had come for names, for human stories, and what I found was emptiness wrapped in the illusion of care. The building didn't feel haunted by ghosts. It felt haunted by the absence of memory, the kind of void left behind when people are erased with intention. The wind howled through broken windows as I climbed back out, and I could swear it carried voices with it. Not whispers, but the sharp breath of lives held too tightly, too long. And the towns, the state, the system, they all helped. Whether through ignorance, complicity, or fear, they looked away, and now even the echoes were growing faint. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there listening to the town breathe outside my window, and I promised myself that I would find something more. A name, a birth certificate, a photo, anything to prove these children weren't just numbers on a forgotten page. Because if I couldn't, then their suffering would remain buried in brick and ash, and no one would remember that they had ever lived at all. The deeper I went into the silence of the Winslow legacy, the more the silence began to resist me, not just through absence, but through contradiction, like a story that refused to be told, shifting each time I got close to the truth, and nowhere was that more palpable than in the people of Elm Ridge themselves. I started knocking on doors, respectfully at first, then with growing insistence as I encountered the same rehearsed, hollow statements again and again. The Winslows were good folks. They help a lot of children. Not my place to say more, each delivered with a tight smile or averted gaze, as if some invisible line divided what could be said from what had to remain buried. I spoke with Martha Croy, a retired schoolteacher who taught from 1955 to 1978, and when I asked whether she'd ever had a student from Hollow Glen, her brow furrowed in confusion, and then something else, maybe fear. "Well, now," she said slowly, fingers gripping her teacup with knuckles white as chalk, "I suppose I must have. Wouldn't I have?" I watched her wrestle with her own memory. The way people do when they realize something should be there, and isn't, like discovering a photo album with all the faces scratched out. I pressed further, asking if she remembered any names, any moments, and she grew quiet before finally saying, "I remember the uniforms. They came in gray. But I don't recall faces. Isn't that strange?" That phrase again. I heard it everywhere I went. Isn't that strange? The words became a haunting chorus, echoing down the empty alleys of this investigation. And each time I heard them, they cut deeper, because yes, it was strange. So strange it bordered on impossible, and yet no one seemed to want to address it. I visited the Elm Ridge Library again and asked to see their microfilm archives. I spent a day scanning school photos, fair announcements, graduation programs, looking for anything, even a single mention of a child from a Winslow orphanage. Nothing. No names. No group photos. No awards. I found photos of children from every other institution in the area. Even the church choir had listings, but not a single scrap tying a child to Hollow Glen or any of the other Winslow homes. I contacted a woman named Irene Sanders, now in her 80s, whose father had worked maintenance at Hollow Glen in the 1940s. She lived in a nearby assisted living center and agreed to see me, though her voice was brittle with age and her mind drifted at times. When I asked her what she remembered of the orphanage, her eyes narrowed. "My father never let me near it," she said. Said it wasn't a place for children. That always confused me. I asked if he ever said why. She shook her head. Only that the children weren't like other children. Said they didn't laugh. Said they were quiet in the wrong way. I pressed her, gently, asking what that meant. She paused and whispered, like they knew something they weren't supposed to. I asked if she remembered any names, and she just looked out the window for a long time before saying, "There was a girl, maybe Ruthie or Rosie. No, I think I made that up." I left with more questions than answers. What was it about these children that made everyone forget them? Why did people seem more afraid of remembering than they were of forgetting? It was as if the act of recollection itself had been poisoned. I broadened my search, driving to nearby towns where the other Winslow homes once stood. Each time, I encountered the same pattern: local pride in the Winslows, vague praise about helping the community, and not a single concrete memory of the children. At one location in Ransford, New Hampshire, where Winslow Haven once operated, I found a historical placard noting the Winslows' contribution to post-war humanitarian relief. I walked the grounds, now a park, and saw families playing, children running barefoot in the grass, completely unaware of what had once stood beneath them. I spoke to a woman walking her dog nearby and asked if she knew the land's history. She smiled and said, "Oh, they say it was an orphanage once, but I don't think it ever opened." I told her it had, that over 80 children had lived there. She blinked. "Are you sure?" Yes, I was starting to feel in my bones that certainty that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong, and that no one wanted to be the one to admit it. My notes became erratic, cluttered with question marks and exclamation points, arrows pointing to blank spaces, names half recalled and crossed out. I was chasing phantoms, not ghosts but bureaucratic ones, the kind that live in the shadows of systems, decisions made in offices with drawn blinds, in ink that faded by design. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the state for any surviving documents on the Winslow Foundation, and weeks later, received a letter stating that the foundation had been dissolved in 1971, and that all records were either lost in a fire or deemed non-essential. I stared at that phrase, non-essential, and felt my hand shake. How do you deem the lives of children non-essential? The weight of what I was uncovering began to crush me, not because I feared where it was going, but because I feared what it implied, that these children weren't just forgotten. They were made forgettable, designed to be erased. That night, I reread Evelyn Winslow's letter again and again, each time noticing how much it said without saying anything at all. We make homes for those time would otherwise abandon. It was a noble phrase, wrapped in compassion, but now it read like a justification, like an admission of something darker, a cover. I circled back to the town clerk's office in Elm Ridge and asked about property records, trying to trace ownership transfers, contractor names, Anything that could reveal who built these places, who ran them, who inspected them. The clerk, a thin, pale man named Lionel, was polite but visibly uncomfortable. That was a different time, he kept saying. Things were less documented back then. I asked him how it was possible that none of the children ever showed up in county birth records. He shrugged. Maybe they came from other states, or weren't born in hospitals. It was an answer that explained nothing. On impulse, I pulled out a photograph I'd taken inside Hollow Glen, the one with the row of children's shoes, and showed it to him. He looked at it for a long time, jaw tightening. "I remember those," he said quietly. "We used to find them in the woods behind the property. A lot of shoes. Never knew where they came from." I asked if anyone ever reported it. He shook his head. It wasn't something we talked about. And there was again silence, not ignorance, not accident. The systemic machinery that allowed names to be erased. I didn't know how much further I could push before something pushed back. But I also knew that if I stopped now, those children would remain nameless shadows forever. And I could no longer live with that. I wasn't prepared for what I found next, though in hindsight, every step of this journey had been leading me toward it. Every unanswered question, every empty file cabinet, every evasive smile layering into the quiet scream I now carried behind my ribs. And that scream erupted when I opened the door to a storage unit rented by the Winslow estate, untouched since 1972. Its key handed to me by an elderly attorney who'd spent most of our conversation explaining why he couldn't legally disclose anything, and then, in a breathless moment of either guilt or weakness, slid the key across the table and whispered, "But if you find what I think you might, leave my name out of it." The unit was in a storage facility just outside Danvers, a concrete skeleton of rusted corrugated steel and flaking paint, the kind of place people forget on purpose. The number on the unit was faded but legible, 308. I opened under a slate-gray sky, and the door groaned upward like the lid of a coffin, releasing a gust of stale, dry air that smelled faintly of mildew and aged wood, and inside, in the dull beam of my flashlight, I found what I didn't know I'd been searching for, a single metal filing cabinet bolted into cement floor, its surface pocked with rust, but its drawers still locked tight. I forced the top one open with a crowbar, hard in my throat, and inside were ledgers for thick leather-bound books, each labeled with year range, and each filled with columns of meticulous handwriting. At first glance, they looked like standard institutional logs, lists of names, dates of intake, notes on behavior, medical assessments. But they were different in one crucial way. Every child listed was marked with a single initial, no last names, just A, J, S, and so on, and in red ink next to most names was a check mark or an X. The annotations were coded, impersonal, transferred, observed, held, and every so often a chilling word, unfit. But it was the fifth ledger, hidden beneath the others, unmarked and smaller, that gutted me entirely. Unlike the others, it had no cover label, no clear date range, and inside were pages of first names only, hundreds of them, each written in a more hurried hand, as though whoever recorded them no longer cared for order, only for getting them down before forgetting. And almost every name had been crossed out in red, not checked, not marked for transfer, crossed out, slashed through with hard, deliberate strokes. I sat down right there on the cold concrete, the ledger trembling in my hands as I flipped page after page. Lena, George, Beth, Harlan, Emily, Quinn, and then nothing. The entry stopped suddenly on a blank page halfway through, as though the recorder had been interrupted or the names had run out or something darker, unspeakable, had occurred. My chest tightened with a heat I didn't recognize at first. Anger, yes, but also grief, the kind that feels older than you are, like mourning something you've only just realized you lost. This was the missing piece, the fifth ledger, the records no one had ever mentioned. And it didn't feel like a log. It felt like a list of erasures, of endings. I flipped to the back and found something that made my blood run cold, a set of dates, written small and cramped. April 3rd, 1956, last transfer. May 7th, 1956, final inventory. May 12th, cleared. No explanation, no signature, just those 3 lines. Cleared. Cleared of what? Of whom? I photographed every page and left the unit in a daze. feeling the weight of those names press against my spine with every step. That night, I stared at the photograph for hours, trying to cross-reference them with anything in public databases. Missing children reports, census data, even gravestones, but nothing matched. These children didn't exist in any system I could access. They had been known just long enough to be written down, and then they vanished. But they were real, I knew that now. The red ink proved it. Someone had taken the time to record their presence, to acknowledge them just enough to erase them properly. An erasure wasn't an accident. It was structured, systemic. The excess weren't marks of error. They were decisions. And whoever made them kept that ledger separate, hidden, like a confession too dangerous to burn. I began to spiral. Sleep fractured by the sound of names whispered in the dark, always in the same mechanical tone, always followed by the sound of ink being scraped across paper. I felt them watching, not as spirits, but as truths waiting to be remembered. I printed the names from the ledger and posted them on the motel wall, like a crime board, tracing patterns, looking for connections, but there were none. The names were varied, spread across ages and regions, and the randomness made it worse. It meant this wasn't about accidents or sickness. It was about choice. The Winslows had built sanctuaries. Yes, but sanctuaries from what? From shame? From scrutiny? From empathy? I thought again of the phrase from the matron's log. 3 unfit for March quota, not transferred. What happened to the unfit? What happened to the ones who didn't get checked? I started calling every archivist, historian, and social worker I knew, asking if anyone had heard of institutional record-keeping like this. Anonymous, impersonal, coded in red. Most said no. One, a retired caseworker from the 70s, paused before saying, there were places back then not illegal, just unregulated. Places where kids disappeared in paperwork. Disappeared in paperwork. That's exactly what had happened here. These children weren't lost. They were hidden, disposed of through red ink and silence. I no longer cared about caution or subtlety. I made copies of the Fifth Ledger pages and started mailing them to investigative contacts, legal aid groups, anyone who might know how to dig deeper. But a fear had settled into my bones, too. One I didn't know how to shake. Because if someone went to this much trouble to erase these lives, what would they do to someone who tried to resurrect them? I couldn't stop shaking as I taped the last name to the wall. Mira, no mark, no X, just a name, alone. I stared at it for what felt like hours, wondering who she was, whether she ever had a birthday, whether anyone had ever said her name with love. The Fifth Ledger had changed everything. It wasn't just a document. It was a graveyard, a confession, a scream pressed into paper. And I was the first person in 50 years to hear it. I found him by accident, though later I'd wonder whether some part of him had been waiting to be found. His name surfacing in an old newsletter I collected from the Danvers Historical Society. One brief mention of a Harold Lunt, noted in a 1955 article as the primary delivery boy servicing Hollow Glen Orphanage. Barely a footnote in a column about youth employment. But to me it rang like a bell in a dead town. And when I tracked him down, to a care facility in western Massachusetts, still living, 94 years old, and mostly lucid according to staff. I called in every favor I could to get through the door, disguising my desperation in polite inquiry until they allowed me into his room, a narrow, beige-lit space that smelled of antiseptic and lavender oil, where I found him sitting by the window in a wheelchair, hands resting still but twitching slightly, like they remembered work long after the body had forgotten how to do it. When I introduced myself and said I was researching Hollow Glen, something passed over his face, not recognition exactly, but the shadow of it, as if I had spoken aloud a name he had spent decades trying not to hear. You're the first one to ask in a long time, he said, his voice papery but sharp at the edges, and when I showed him the photos of the Fifth Ledger, he closed his eyes and didn't open them again for a full minute. That book shouldn't exist, he whispered, barely audible. I thought they got rid of all of them. I asked him what he meant, gently, trying not to spook the memory loose too fast, and he spoke in fits and starts, the story coming out like stones tumbling downhill. He was 14 when he began delivering goods to Hollow Glen, bread and dairy mostly, 3 mornings a week with a handcart and instructions not to linger, not to talk, not to look around more than he had to. It didn't feel like a school, he said. Felt like a hospital with no nurses or a camp with no noise. He remembered the first time he was made to wait in the courtyard because the side entrance was locked. He stood there for 20 minutes and didn't hear a single voice from inside. Not a laugh, not a shout, not even a cough. Kids make noise, he said. They bump into things, they cry, they sing, but not there. It was like they'd been taught to disappear. He looked down at his hands then and admitted something that made my throat tighten. He never saw more than 2 children at a time in all the years he worked there, and even then, they never made eye contact, never spoke, never looked alive. I asked if he remembered their names, but he shook his head. They didn't wear names, just numbers, little paper tags on strings around their necks. I showed him one of the blank name tags from the attic, and he flinched. That's them, he said. That's how they kept track. You'd see them in the laundry bins, sometimes. Never any toys, just tags. He spoke about the staff in vague terms, always in uniform, always with clipped voices, and always walking in pairs, never alone. There were parts of the building he was never allowed near. The lower levels, the west wing, and what he called the black room, a section of the basement behind a locked door that no one ever entered without keys he never saw. But what haunted him most, he said, were the days when his deliveries were turned away, not canceled, just refused, because, as one staff member told him, we're not feeding today. He said it happened a few times a year, always in early spring or late fall, and he thought nothing of it then, just figured they had a surplus or were out for a field trip. But later, after he stopped working, he started to wonder. You don't skip meals for kids, he said, especially not kids that small. When I asked what he thought happened on those days, he looked at me for a long time, his lips pressed in, and finally said, I think they made choices about who was staying. His hands trembled then, and he wiped his eyes roughly like he hated the tears. There were fewer shoes on the steps after, he added. I didn't notice right away, but it stuck with me. I asked why he'd never told anyone. He said he tried once, in 1963, to speak to a church official, but they told him the Winslows were sacred, that the homes had saved thousands, and that rumors only hurt the living. I buried it, he said, put it somewhere deep. I asked about the red ink, the excess in the ledger, and he nodded slowly. That was Evelyn's code, he said. She didn't sign papers. She just marked them. Red was final. When I showed him the crossed-out names, he stopped me on one, Tomas. He stared at it and said he had a limp, real small, always watched the sky. I don't know why I remember him. He paused. He wasn't there one day. Never saw him again. No one said a thing. He stared out the window then, into the windless trees. They called it mercy, he said, when they made them disappear. Said it was mercy. I left the facility that day with a sickness I couldn't name, like my soul had absorbed something rotten and couldn't shake it loose. Harold's story confirmed what I feared. These children weren't lost. They were erased methodically, under the guise of philanthropy. The fifth ledger was a death roll. And somewhere, buried under layers of good press and marble plaques, was the truth that the Winslow orphanages were never about saving lives. They were about control, about selection, about silence. And now that silence was cracking, I, in the weeks following my meeting with Harold Lunt, I couldn't stop thinking about the word he'd used, mercy, and how it echoed with such contradiction, as though it had been warped by repetition, hollowed out by misuse, and it was that very word that gnawed at me when I came across a forgotten folder in the Elmridge Historical Archive marked Winslow, Civic Contributions, Special Events. Tucked behind a row of rusted file drawers, and inside were programs, flyers, and faded photographs of an annual community gathering I'd never heard mentioned in any official record. The Ceremony of the White Lilies, held every spring from 1931 until 1956. The ceremony was presented publicly as a celebration of rebirth and renewal, coinciding with the blooming of lilies throughout the Winslow estate gardens, and it was always sponsored directly by the Winslow Foundation. Each flyer featured a recurring emblem, a white lily over an open book, and listed a schedule that included choral performances, scripture readings, and a closing speech titled simply A Reflection on Innocence. At first, it all seemed innocuous, even uplifting, until I noticed the participants were never named. No choirs listed, No speakers identified, just placeholders like orphanage representatives or voices of the sanctuary. That absence felt deliberate. I found a newspaper clipping from 1949 describing the event as a moving tribute to purists among us, and another that mentioned Evelyn Winslow personally handing out white lilies to select children in attendance. Children never photographed, never named, and always described in vague, angelic terms. I began asking around about the ceremony, and most locals my age had never heard of it, but a few of the town's oldest residents remember the name. Their reactions disturbingly consistent: discomfort, confusion, and a tendency to grow suddenly quiet. I met with Thurlow, 93 years old and sharp-eyed, who had attended several of the ceremonies as a teenager in the 1940s when her father was on the town council. At first, she was dismissive, calling the events pretentious flower shows, but as I pressed and showed her photos, something shifted in her posture. She leaned forward, took off her glasses, and said, "They didn't let people mingle. You could watch, but you weren't supposed to approach the children. They came in from the sides, always quiet, always moving together like they'd rehearsed it." I asked if she'd ever spoken to any of them. "No," she said after a pause. "You didn't talk to the Lily children." I asked her what that meant, and her face darkened. That's what they called them, the Lily children. Like they were different, chosen. But I remember thinking they didn't look happy. They looked prepared. The next day, I visited the church archives and found an old sermon booklet from 1952 with a handwritten note. WL ceremony, confirmed 13 participants. Evelyn spoke of ascension again. Lily passage read as always. I didn't know what the Lily passage was, but the repetition of ascension caught my attention. It wasn't religious in the traditional sense. It felt ceremonial, coded. I tracked down a former cook named Eleanor Bishop, now living in a nursing home in Norwich, who had worked at the New Hampshire Winslow home from 1950 to 1956. When I asked about the ceremony of the white lilies, she grew pale. "You shouldn't go digging into that," she said softly. "It wasn't for outsiders." I told her what I'd found, about the names crossed out in the fifth ledger, and her expression broke. "We didn't know at first," she said. "They told us it was like a reward, that the children chosen for the lily ceremony were being given a new life." I asked what she meant by that. "We thought they were being adopted or moved to a better place. That's what they told us. But then I noticed they never came back, ever, and no one talked about it. No one asked." She paused. "I remember a boy, Callum. He was small, maybe 6. Sweet. He was chosen one spring. He cried when they gave him the flower. I never saw him again." Her hands trembled. I didn't ask. I should have asked. I showed her the final page of the fifth ledger, the one that said May 12th, cleared, and she covered her mouth. "That was the last one," she said. "That's when it stopped." I left her in tears, not out of interrogation, but because I could feel something enormous cracking beneath the surface, a grief long frozen that was finally thawing, ugly and real. The ceremony of the white lilies was not a celebration. It was a selection, a judgment dressed in flowers and hymns. And each spring, a handful of children were paraded before the community, praised for their purity, handed a symbol of innocence, and then removed, quietly, completely, and forever. Not one of them ever returned. Not one of them left a name behind. It was a ritual of disappearance disguised as a rite of hope, and the town, the church, the state, they all watched it happen year after year and called it mercy, called it tradition, called it good. And Evelyn Winslow, always smiling, always at the center, handing out lilies like tokens, like permissions, like sentences. That night, I drove to the old Winslow estate grounds where the ceremonies were held, now an overgrown field bordered by collapsed fencing and wild lilies choking the soil. I stood in the dark and listened to the wind stir through the petals, and I imagined rows of children walking silently into that field, white flowers in their hands, unaware of what awaited them. I imagined their small backs retreating into the woods behind the estate, never to emerge again. I whispered names into the silence: Mira, Tomas, Callum, not to summon them, but to acknowledge that they had existed, that someone finally remembered. The ceremony of the white lilies wasn't just a pageant. It was a mask, a final farewell. And now, with every piece of truth I uncovered, I felt myself pulling it off, one petal at a time, revealing the rot beneath the bloom. IT was a tax map that led me there, an old county property grid unearthed in a dusty drawer at the Rentham Land Office, while I cross-referenced the Winslow Foundation's known holdings, a nearly illegible corner of the map marked Parcel B7, listed not under Evelyn or Thomas Winslow's names, but beneath a shell entity called Arbiter Trust, one that had surfaced before in the back pages of their 1937 foundation filings, but never linked to any orphanage or philanthropic site directly, and the address 104 Needle Street didn't appear on any modern GPS database, not even in the town's digital property records, which explained why the road itself had faded into nothing more than a deer trail behind a neglected industrial lot on the southern edge of Elmridge, where brambles rose like claws and the trees stood too close together, suffocating out sunlight, as if trying to shield whatever was hidden at the end. I followed the trail on foot, heart thudding, the forest unervingly quiet except for the distant hum of factory long shut down, and after nearly a mile, I saw it, the house. 2 stories of gray clapboard, slump but intact, roof warped like a broken spine, windows boarded from the inside, and a crude chain wrapped tight around the front door, rusted shut. I circled the perimeter, noting the absence of a mailbox, no utility connections, no evidence of human activity for decades, and in the back, a cellar bulkhead partially buried under leaves and debris. The latch snapped and hinges fused by rust, but after an hour of struggling, I pried it open and descended into darkness thick with the scent of mold, wood rot, and something else. Something sour and old, like grief turned physical. The basement was low-ceilinged. The concrete floor buckled in places, and along one wall stood a line of metal-framed cots, child-sized, each stripped bare except for a single, identical wool blanket folded at the center, precisely, ritualistically. Above the cots, the wall had been painted in a soft blue now stained and flaking, decorated with childish stencils, stars, birds, flowers, and yet not a single name, drawing, or personal mark was visible, as though whatever had lived here had been forbidden to exist beyond silhouette. I moved cautiously, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and discovered a wooden crate in the corner, filled with small canvas bags, each with brass number tags stitched onto the fabric. Inside one, I found a tiny pair of shoes, polished but unworn. Another held a hand mirror, the glass cracked, and another contained a thick envelope of paper slips, each one marked with a date and a set of initials, always 2 letters, always followed by a red stamp reading compliant. What did that mean? I didn't know yet, but each artifact felt like a muted scream, and when I climbed the first floor to the cellar's narrow stairwell, what I found there made my breath seize. The house had been outfitted not as a residence, but as a holding facility. The rooms were sparse, floorboards reinforced with iron plates beneath worn carpet, and in the hallway outside the kitchen, a wall of shallow cubbies labeled with numbers, not names, each holding small toiletries, all unopened, all standardized. The air in the kitchen was dry, the cabinets still stocked with canned food decades expired, and in the living room, a ledger sat on a metal desk beside a manual typewriter with a broken ribbon. The ledger was different from the others, handwritten, but less formal, more hurried. It listed dates and movements. Arrive February 13th. Observation begins. February 15th, Lily pre-screening. 2/18ths, compliant. 2/20ths, removed. Removed. No details. No direction. Just removed. No details. No direction. Just removed. I closed the book, sick to my stomach. Upstairs, the bedrooms were fitted with bunk beds bolted to the wall, 2 to a room, the walls padded with canvas, windows nailed shut, no toys, no books, only a speaker grill high in each corner. Why would a house need an internal broadcast system? On the smallest door, what looked like a linen closet, I found a metal hatch, and inside, a shaft lined with rubber, a chute, industrial, like the ones used in laundromats. But there were no laundry rooms, no appliances, only more silence. In the final room, what appeared to be an office, I found a framed photo turned face down on the desk. When I flipped it over, my blood turned cold. It was Evelyn Winslow, standing in front of this very house, smiling tightly, and behind her were 3 children with identical blank expressions, each holding a white lily. The same smile, the same uniform gray clothing. No names, no labels, just that pose, fixed like a family portrait of something that had never been a family at all. In the drawer below the desk was a keyring with dozens of small tags attached, each one bearing a number and a single initial. I took one and held it in my palm, and the weight of it nearly buckled me. These were the uncounted, the unseen, the Lily children, not in ceremony but in custody, shuffled and sorted in a house that didn't belong on any map. I left the house on Needle Street in a daze, the stillness of it clinging to my clothes like dust, and I knew now with crushing certainty, that the Winslow orphanages were only the face of something deeper, something designed not just to contain children, but to condition them, to process them through a system too sanitized to call torture, but too structured to be anything else. They were preparing them for what I didn't yet know, but the truth was closer, and it was worse than I ever imagined. He contacted me through a burner email addressed 2 days after I published a private report online summarizing the Fifth Ledger, and what I found in a house on Needle Street. No names, just a signal flare to other potential witnesses, an invitation to break silence if there was anyone left who still remembered, and the message simply read, I used to process records for the Office of State Institutional Oversight, 1973 to 1988. I know about the Winslow closures. Meet me at the Reservoir parking lot off Route 9 p.m. Tuesday. No recordings. I went. Of course I went. When I arrived, the lot was dark, lit only by the fading blue of dusk and the low hum of crickets, and a man was already waiting near the edge of the overlook, hunched inside a beige raincoat, head down, cigarette smoke curling around his face like fog. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake my hand. He just gestured for me to sit on the bench and said, I'll talk, but if you quote me, I'll deny everything. His voice was rough, aged but clear, and what he told me in the next 43 minutes shredded the last scraps of comfort I'd been clinging to. He started with a simple statement. There were never supposed to be any records, not after the directive. I asked what directive, and he lit another cigarette before saying, in 1971, the state initiated a clean slate policy for all privately operated children's homes predating 1960. That included the Winslow sites. The reasoning was legal liability, potential lawsuits from former wards, pressure from lobbyists trying to privatize welfare entirely. So we were told, quietly, unofficially, to purge. I asked how many records were destroyed. He exhaled smoke and said, all of them. Intake files, medical reports, incident logs, psychological evaluations. Everything. But the Winslow files, those were different. They weren't incomplete. They were coded, sanitized, already scrubbed before they ever reached us. It was like they expected to vanish. I showed him the images of the Fifth Ledger, and he stiffened. Jesus, you found it. He stared at the screen for a long time, mouth tight. We always heard rumors about a fifth book. We called it the Ledger That Bled. Red ink. Final designations. I was told it was apocryphal, that even if it had existed, it had been destroyed long ago. I asked who gave that order. No one ever signed anything, he said. That was the genius of it. Everything was verbal. At most, you get a post-it or a memo that disappeared the next day. But I remember one name, Arthur Loring, Assistant Deputy Director. He handled the Winslow files personally. One day they were in the vault, and the next they were gone. When I asked where they'd been moved, he looked at me and said, they've been laid to rest. Like he was talking about corpses. I asked if anyone objected. We all did, he said quietly, in our own ways. But it didn't matter. You objected, you were transferred, or quietly demoted, or pushed into retirement. He turned to me then and said something I've never forgotten. The state didn't bury the children. The state buried the evidence that they were ever here. I pressed him harder. What happened to the children? What were the excess for? Why the removals? Why the silence? He shook his head. We don't know. That was part of it. All the Winslow homes reported their own data. No audits. No oversight. It was like a private kingdom. By the time we took control, there were no children left, just buildings full of dust and old paper. But there were whispers of selections, of relocations that didn't lead to adoptions. There was a rumor that some of the homes had secret agreements with state mental institutions, that children who didn't meet behavioral criteria were declared non-viable and quietly committed. No hearings, no diagnoses, just gone. He stopped talking for a moment and rubbed his eyes. One day I saw a file slip through, just initials and a photo of a boy, maybe 7, blank eyes. The case note read, disposition, compliant, eligible for conclusion. I didn't know what that meant. Still don't. But I've never forgotten that phrase. Eligible for conclusion. My hands were shaking. I asked why he was telling me this now. He stared at the reservoir, voice low. Because I'm tired of pretending we didn't know. We knew. Maybe not the full scope. Maybe not every name. But we knew enough. And we stayed quiet. Because the Winslows had power. Because the system protected itself. Because no one wanted to unravel the myth of benevolence. He dropped a cigarette and crushed it beneath his heel. You're the first one who's ever asked the right questions. So now I'm giving you the one answer I never put on paper. He stood and walked toward his car, leaving me frozen on the bench, his final words hanging in the dark like a sentence passed. They weren't lost. They were erased, on purpose, by people like me. I never learned his name. I never saw him again. But that night, staring out at the still waters of the reservoir, I felt the weight of his confession settle on me like a verdict. The state hadn't failed those children. It had executed their disappearance with bureaucratic precision. And now, it was up to me to make sure their silence ended with me at BY the time I walked into the Elmridge Town Hall. I was carrying more than just a file folder. I was carrying names, shadows, absences pressed into paper, a weight that clung to my bones and refused to lift, and though I knew no one had asked of this reckoning, I felt their eyes land on me with a practiced, polite disinterest that quickly soured the moment I said the name Winslow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply began showing them the documents, the Fifth Ledger pages, the photographs from Hollow Glen and Needle Street, the interview transcripts, even the scraps of fabric with the brass number tags, and I watched as the air in the room changed. Some leaned back, as if I had just uncapped the poison. Others sat rigid, knuckles whitening around pens. I read from the ledger slowly, name by name, letting each cross-out echo in the silence, and when I reached the end, I said only, "These children lived. They suffered, and you let yourselves forget." A long pause followed. Then Councilman Harris, a man in his 70s with eyes that darted to the exit more than they met mine, said, "That's a very serious accusation, and most of your sources are unconfirmed." I handed him the copy of the state employee's statement and watched him scan the lines with growing agitation. "This proves nothing criminal," he muttered. "It proves intent," I said. "It proves erasure." Another council member, a woman named Agnes, sat forward. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke. "You say these children disappeared. But why would a woman like Evelyn Winslow, someone who gave so much, do something so monstrous?" I looked at her and said, "Maybe because she knew no one would question her. Because you are all too proud to look too closely." Murmurs began to spread across the room, uncomfortable shifting in seats, whispers just above a hiss. But then from the back row, a voice broke the noise. "He's right." Heads turned. An older woman, slight and gray-haired, stood with trembling hands clasped before her. Her nameplate read Marjorie Heller. She had been a councilwoman for decades, practically part of the architecture. "I was there," she said, eyes glistening. "I was one of the children." The room fell deathly still. She looked at me and then down at her hands. "I never told anyone. I don't remember the first 6 years of my life. They told me I was adopted, but I was already 7 when I came to Elmridge. I had scars. I had nightmares I couldn't explain, but I had no papers, no name." She took a shuddering breath. "When I saw your notes last night, I recognized the tags. I found one in an old box my adoptive mother kept, brass with an R. She pulled it from her purse and held it up, and I felt the air thicken like a storm pressing through the walls. 'We always thought you were from Vermont,' someone whispered. Marjorie shook her head. I was from Hollow Glen. The room was no longer simply uncomfortable. It was imploding, the weight of suppressed decades caving in all at once. Councilman Harris stood abruptly, muttering about legal liability, about press exposure, about defamation and the importance of context, but no one was listening anymore. Marjorie's confession had cracked something open. People began speaking over one another. Fragments of memories, suspicions, things seen and dismissed. Shoes found in the woods, children who arrived and vanished, rumors of quiet weeks at the orphanage. And amid the chaos, I watched as a woman began to weep openly, her hands covering her mouth, whispering, "I worked in the kitchen. I thought they were just transferred." One by one, layers peeled back. Some confessed small truths, complicity by inaction, by fear, by convenience. Others stayed silent, too shaken or ashamed to speak. I didn't press them. I wasn't there to destroy them. I was there to make them see, to force this town to acknowledge what it had forgotten, or more accurately, what it had chosen to forget. The Winslows hadn't just built orphanages. They had built a machine that ran on silence, and this town had been its engine. Every polite nod and ribbon-cutting a cog in its function. As the council meeting dissolved into hushed conversations and rattled breaths, I gathered my documents and stood to leave. But before I could exit, Marjorie approached me. "You gave them back to me," she said softly. "The ones I couldn't remember." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded, and she squeezed my hand gently. "Don't stop now," she whispered. "Somewhere, someone still knows more. Someone has to." I walked out of the building into the heavy night, the smell of lilacs hanging in the air, and for the first time, I felt less alone, but not relieved, not healed, because remembering wasn't enough. Not anymore. Now came the reckoning. And I had only just begun. The call came from a contractor named Doug Whitman, a man with sun-browned skin and thick fingers stained by years of dirt and diesel, who'd been hired by the county to excavate part of the old Winslow estate for future development, a shallow topographical survey to make way for potential solar panels. And he'd found my number to the town clerk, said he remembered me from a council meeting, said he thought maybe I'd want to see what we turned up, though the way his voice broke at the end of the sentence made my stomach lurch before I even asked where. I drove the familiar road in a daze, every mile a pulse in my chest, the overgrown field now clear to brush, its edges marked with neon stakes and heavy machinery. And when I arrived, Doug led me to the southeast corner of the property where a shallow pit had been carved into loam no more than 2 feet deep, revealing something smooth and long buried, a slab of stone cracked down the center, stained with root systems and the dark crust of time. I crouched beside it, running my fingers across the surface, and there they were, names, not full names. First names only, faint and nearly illegible, as if the rain had tried for years to carry them away. Lena, Callum, Ruthie, Mira, Jasper, Tomas, and more dozens, some etched deeply, others barely scratched into stone. Each name marked by a handprint carved beside it, a child's handprint, not natural stone formation, not erosion. These were intentional, and they hadn't been made for display. The slab had been laid flat, face down, pressed into the earth as if to hide it forever. I asked Doug if anything else had been found. He nodded, hesitating before lifting a tarp beside the dig. Beneath it were bones, not whole bodies, but fragments. Small ribs, a jawbone, the tiny arc of foot, all intermingled and jumbled with pieces of cloth, metal tags, and crumbling buttons. "We're not touching anything else," he said. "This is bigger than any of us. We've got the state archaeology team coming. But I wanted you to see it first. Thought maybe you'd recognize something." I didn't recognize the bones. I recognized the silence, the deafening, gut-punching silence that radiated from that shallow grave like a siren. These were the children. These were the ones who never got transferred, never got adopted, never got spoken of again. They had not simply vanished. They had been buried, hidden, ritualized in secret beneath a monument too heavy to mourn, too sacred to destroy. Someone had taken care in marking their passing. Not enough to honor them publicly, but enough to show that someone, somewhere, had known this wasn't right. I crouched there for what felt like hours, reading the names aloud, one by one, letting each syllable fall like an apology into the earth. This was not closure. This was confrontation. A reckoning delivered not in words or headlines, but in broken bone and the faint whisper of names no longer erased. I took a photo of the slab, not to share but to remember. I wanted the world to know, but more than that, the Winslow legacy was not one of charity. It was one of concealment, of manipulation. And now, beneath our feet, the truth had finally been unearthed. I end the weeks that followed the excavation, as forensic teams cataloged the bones and town historians fought over which committees should contextualize the findings. I found myself drifting between numbness and fury, as if my body couldn't decide whether to collapse or explode under the weight of knowing, truly knowing what had been done, not in some distant past, but here, in this quiet New England town, behind brick walls and smiles and check-writing ceremonies, where children were stripped of names, silenced beneath lilies, and laid into soil as if their lives were inconvenient clutter to be swept away. I couldn't sleep, not because I feared retaliation or controversy. Those threats had already come in murmurs, anonymous emails, veiled warnings, but because I kept hearing the names in the ledger, the ones I'd read aloud, the ones carved into stone, and worse, the ones missing, the blanks that would never be filled. Because even the bones couldn't answer every question, and I realized that uncovering truth was not the same as justice, that proving it had happened would never be enough if it didn't hurt, if it didn't burn down the stories that let it happen. And so I wrote. God help me. I wrote everything. The full report, the ledger, the photos, the interviews, the archival records, the testimonies from Harold Lunt and Marjorie Heller, even the names of those who had sat in silence for decades, and I published it all, raw and unredacted, under my own name, on every platform that would take it, knowing it would ruin reputations, unravel legacies, spark lawsuits and disbelief, and maybe even denial. But I didn't care, because the Winslows had already stolen too much silence, and I was done giving them more. The backlash was immediate. Calls from law firms, letters of censure from historical societies, veiled threats from politicians. But when it came something else, too, letters from people who had lived in the shadows of those homes, who remembered fragments, who now saw their own childhood traumas reflected in the ledger's pages. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in my grief, because others were grieving too, reclaiming their past, their pain, their names, and I knew that was all I could offer. Not justice, not peace, but memory, loud and unignorable, a testimony carved not into stone but into story. The monument was eventually moved, placed in the town square, beneath a bronze plaque that bore no foundation name, no politician's credit, only the words, "To those we erased, you are not forgotten." And I stood before it on the day it was unveiled, wind pressing cold against my jacket, as school children passed it without understanding, as old men lowered their heads, and I thought about Evelyn Winslow, about her pressed suits and immaculate handwriting, and how no amount of benevolence could undo the damage of orchestrated forgetting. The town will heal perhaps in time, but I don't know if I will, because there are still questions I can't answer, children I can't name, silences I can't break, and I carry them with me like a second heartbeat, always just behind the noise. But this I promise, to them and anyone who still wonders if the past matters. I will remember, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, because no record means no peace. And now that the record exists, peace is no longer a lie we're allowed to tell.